Jonathan Blake here. Before we dive in, if you value clear, no-fluff narration that connects the dots in world events, take a second to subscribe to the channel. And while you listen, I want you to pick one moment in this story that hits you the hardest and drop it in the comments, because your perspective helps steer what I cover next. Tonight's story isn't just about a war on a map. It's about a system under pressure, a leadership circle that looks smaller by the day, and a public that's being pushed into silence at the exact moment reality is getting louder. The core claim being whispered more openly now is this: Putin is losing control, and the signs are showing up in three places at once. On the battlefield, inside Moscow itself, and, most dangerously for the Kremlin, inside the propaganda machine that was supposed to keep the entire narrative glued together. And here's the first engagement question I want you thinking about as we go. If you suddenly lost mobile internet in your city during a national crisis, what would you do first to figure out what's really happening? Now let's start where the pressure begins, at the front. According to reports and commentary coming from Russian military bloggers themselves, the situation on key lines has turned bleak. They describe Ukrainian forces regaining momentum in a way that feels unfamiliar compared to the grind of recent years. They talk about drones not as a side detail, but as the center of gravity. The language they're using is the language of a force that feels hunted, pinned, and slowly separated into pieces. Their description follows a pattern. First, drones dominate the lower sky. Not jets, not tanks. Drones. Then those drones are used to isolate positions, cutting small groups off from resupply, reinforcement, and coordination. After isolation comes the next phase: barrages of drone strikes, relentless pressure, and then what they describe as a roll-up attack. The kind that doesn't just take a trench but unspools a line, one position after another, until the defensive fabric starts tearing. And they are not subtle about where this leads. They warn of a possible large-scale breakthrough. They reference the shock of 2022, when Russia lost major territory. They openly say this could be worse. That matters because these aren't Ukrainian statements aimed at morale warfare. This is Russian commentary, voiced in public, describing their own weakness. And when the people whose job is to hype confidence start writing like this, it signals something deeper than a single tactical setback. It suggests fear. It suggests a growing belief that the front line is no longer stable. Even their prescriptions sound urgent and almost desperate. They call for immediate organizational and technical measures, specifically to counter drones. They call for new solutions fast, because if action is delayed, tomorrow becomes irreversible. So if this is the reality pressing in from the battlefield, what is the Kremlin doing to manage the political consequences? This is where the story shifts from war to control. Because as the pressure rises, the instinct of an authoritarian system is not to explain. It is to restrict. It is to narrow the public's access to information, compress the range of allowable conversations, and reduce the number of places where truth can travel faster than the official narrative. And that is exactly what is being described in Moscow. Sweeping disruptions of mobile internet service in the largest city in Europe, affecting how people communicate, how they work, and how they share information. Think about the symbolism of that. A modern metropolis, millions of people, suddenly forced into a smaller, older world of communication. Not because the technology failed, but because the state decided it was safer for the public to be less connected. People on the street describe it with anger and disbelief. They describe a feeling of being pushed backward, of being herded away from the modern world and into something that resembles isolation. Some react with bitter sarcasm, like the internet is only the first thing to go, and water and electricity could be next. Others try to sound reasonable and still can't hide the sense that the response is extreme. The official justification is security. The implication is that shutting down mobile internet is necessary to protect citizens from threats connected to the war. But even that narrative has cracks, because Moscow has still faced strikes and disruptions. And when citizens feel both less connected and less protected, the question becomes unavoidable in the mind, even if people are afraid to say it out loud. What exactly is the state capable of delivering now? Then comes another rare moment. A senior figure, Putin's former defense minister, now tied to the security apparatus, openly acknowledging that the depth of threat has changed. The admission is striking because it touches a nerve that Russian officials have traditionally avoided. The message is that areas once considered safely beyond reach are no longer automatically safe, and that the war has widened the danger zone. Even if you strip away the drama and focus purely on logic, the effect is the same. The public hears directly or indirectly that the country is more exposed than it used to be, and that this exposure is tied to decisions made at the top. Now layer that on top of the internet disruptions, and you get a public that feels two things at the same time. They are being told less, and they are fearing more. So where is Putin in all of this? Here, the story becomes not just political, but personal. Reports suggest he has reduced public appearances at the Kremlin, with an unusually long gap between visible events. And in a system like Russia's, absence is never neutral. Absence invites interpretation, and interpretation is dangerous for any leader who relies on the perception of absolute control. The narrative circulating is that Putin has become more concerned about his personal security, watching how modern intelligence and targeting methods have evolved elsewhere, and drawing conclusions about his own risk. The result, according to these reports, is a leader leaning into isolation, physically removing himself from public view while the consequences of the war press down on ordinary people. And this is where the disconnect becomes almost cinematic. As people deal with disrupted communication in a massive capital city, they get statements from officials that sound like they belong to another century. One member of the Russian parliament responded to the situation by essentially normalizing regression, invoking landline telephones and wired communication as if the population should simply adapt, accept interruptions, and return to older systems. The framing is not, this is temporary and we will restore normal life. The framing is, this is the new era and you should get used to it. That kind of messaging doesn't inspire confidence. It signals that the state is preparing the public for a long period of instability and that the solution offered is not progress, but endurance. And still, in the middle of frustration, Russians do what humans often do under pressure. They find humor because humor can be a form of resistance that slips through cracks censorship can't fully seal. A viral-style joke emerges. A man shares online content the old-fashioned way, by writing down links and mailing them. Like social media has been reduced to paper trails and post offices, it's funny on the surface, but the humor has teeth. It's a quiet accusation that the country is moving backward, and that the only way to cope is to laugh so you don't scream. But all of that, battlefield strain, communication restrictions, public frustration, still isn't the most dangerous development for the Kremlin. The most dangerous development is betrayal from inside the narrative engine itself. Because when an opposition figure criticizes Putin, the Kremlin expects it. It can label them, silence them, exile them, or bury them under propaganda. But when a formerly loyal propagandist, someone known for defending the regime and attacking its critics, turns around and publicly denounces Putin, that's different. That kind of rupture sends a signal to everyone watching. Even inside the system, the story is breaking. The figure at the center of this moment is Ilya Remillo, described as a previously reliable pro-Kremlin voice. Someone who had spent time attacking opponents of the regime, someone aligned with the official line, and then, suddenly, he releases a manifesto explaining why he stopped supporting Putin. And it doesn't just criticize policy, it goes straight for legitimacy, responsibility, and personal guilt. He frames it as 5 reasons, and each reason is designed to hit a different pillar holding the regime up. First, he attacks the war itself, not as a noble mission, but as a catastrophe that has expanded far beyond what many were led to believe. He contrasts earlier events that were sold as bloodless with the current reality of mass death and what he calls meat grinder assaults. He argues the war has become a dead end that could drag on for years, and he portrays it as being sustained not for national benefit, but for Putin's personal needs, his complexes, his fixation. Second, he targets the economy and the cost to ordinary people. He talks about sanctions, lost partners, damaged infrastructure, and the staggering scale of resources that could have been used for schools, hospitals, and housing. Instead, he claims the country is feeding a circle of elite enrichment while millions remain poor even in a resource-rich nation. His argument is simple. The state is demanding sacrifice, but the rewards flow upward. Third, he attacks the suffocation of media and internet freedom, and here the hypocrisy is the point. He recalls earlier assurances that Russia would not follow a hardline model of information control, and he argues those assurances were lies. He points to blocked platforms, degraded messaging access, and broader plans for tighter control. He frames this not just as censorship, but as national self-harm, cutting the public off from modern life, education, and even basic services. Then he adds a detail that deepens the sense of dysfunction. The idea that Putin himself does not meaningfully use the internet, that he fears digital exposure. that he doesn't even use common modern devices. And whether every detail of that is accurate or not, the symbolic impact is massive. A leader steering a modern war while being described as technologically detached, dependent on filtered reports from an inner circle that may fear telling him the truth. Fourth, he attacks the longevity of Putin's rule. He describes the years in power as excessive to the point of madness, arguing that endless power corrodes anyone and that a country cannot stay politically healthy when one man sits in the center for decades. He implies that even if Putin once appeared acceptable to many, the situation has passed any reasonable limit and the country needs renewal. Fifth, he attacks Putin's relationship with the people. He argues Putin doesn't respect voters, doesn't want to hear from them, and uses staged events as theater. He claims real criticism inside the system is functionally non-existent because anyone who tries becomes branded, driven out, or destroyed. He frames Putin not as a leader confident enough for honest competition, but as a leader afraid of debates, afraid of real elections, afraid of a public that can actually choose. Then comes the conclusion, and it's the kind of conclusion you almost never see from inside a loyalist space. He calls Putin illegitimate. He calls for resignation. He calls for a trial as a war criminal and a thief. He ends with a declaration of freedom and a kind of anger that sounds less like politics and more like disgust. The reaction, predictably, is shock. Some followers assume he must have been hacked because for many Russians, the idea that someone embedded in the propaganda culture could flip like this feels impossible. But he responds directly, insisting he wasn't hacked, and that his statement is his own. He even sounds surprised that his relatively moderate criticism triggers such intense reaction, and that moment is revealing because it suggests that inside the system, the boundary of permitted speech has narrowed so tightly that even a controlled criticism looks revolutionary. Then he pushes the idea further. He offers a paradox. If Putin had surrounded himself with competent truth-tellers instead of thieves and yes-men, he might have been more effective and therefore more dangerous. But Putin's fear of rivals, fear of criticism, and preference for loyalty over competence has, in this view, hollowed out the system from within. Not with one dramatic explosion, but with slow rot. And rot eventually becomes collapse. Now, I want to give you the second engagement question because it's the one that matters most in this story. Do you think a public split from a loyal propagandist is a one-off shock or the first crack in a much larger collapse? Because that is the real tension here. Not whether one front line moves forward or back. Not even whether Moscow experiences temporary communication disruptions. The deeper question is whether the regime's internal unity is starting to fracture in visible ways, and whether those fractures spread when fear rises and confidence falls. A government can survive battlefield losses if its narrative holds. A government can survive economic pain if its propaganda keeps blame pointed outward. A government can survive criticism if the critics are predictable outsiders. But when the message breaks from inside, when a loyal voice suddenly speaks like an accuser, that changes the emotional math for everyone listening in silence. It tells the public that even the people who used to defend the story may no longer believe it. It tells elites that loyalty might not be rewarded with safety. It tells the system that control is not absolute, because doubt has found a microphone. And when that happens, the bunker mentality becomes more than metaphor. It becomes the strategy. Hide, restrict, suppress, wait it out, and hope the storm passes. But storms like this do not always pass. Sometimes they move inward. So here's where we land. On the ground, Russian sources describe fear of breakthroughs and drone dominance. In the capital, citizens describe disconnection, frustration, and a sense of being dragged backward. At the top, the leader appears more isolated, less visible, more concerned with personal safety. And inside the narrative machine, a loyal propagandist turns into a public accuser. That combination is what makes this moment feel different. If you want more narration like this, direct, structured, and focused on the signals beneath the headlines, subscribe to Jonathan Blake. And seriously, leave a comment with which piece of this story you think is the most important sign of what comes next.